What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Everyday Builds video. My deck was getting a little weathered and experiencing some rot issues, especially in the railing. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I put all new deck boards down and a full new railing on my pre-existing deck. But before we get into it, I want to talk about the overall layout of this deck. I really don't like butt joints when two boards come together to land on a single joist. I think that's kind of a bad thing where each board has to be screwed right at the very end, which just leads to splits and the board popping up, creating a tripping hazard or even a hazard for splinters, things like that. So I like to break a deck into different sections where I can have full runs like you see here. And I break it by running a perpendicular board down the middle. And then what I created here was two 10-foot sections that, again, I can run full distances with my boards without any butt joints. I knew when I bought my house that the deck was in pretty rough shape. But this didn't mean it was a complete teardown. I knew that I could keep most of the structure. All it really needed was some new deck boards and a new railing. Off camera, I removed the railing and most of the deck boards and did some general repair. And after the deck was mostly stripped down, I could then begin laying the deck boards. And like I said in the intro, I laid these deck boards in two 10-foot sections. Here I'm getting started laying the second section of boards, in which I like to start with the third board in from the front edge of the deck. This allows me to get a full piece in where I don't have to notch around those posts. I can lay one single piece and make sure I get that one perfectly straight, because every board after that is going to follow the contour of this, so it's important that this first board is perfect. And something I like to do is use a cheap carpenter's square, and I'll actually drill right through it, creating a jig for all of my screw hole locations. And then all I have to do is line that square up with each joist, and then I'll have perfectly aligned screw holes. You may have noticed in an earlier shot that there is a chalk line that runs along the top of all of these joists. And this is to make sure that this board is installed perfectly straight. And here I use a clamp to apply a little bit of pressure to make sure it aligns with all those chalk lines. And to drive in all these screws, I'm using a new bit that I've never used before from Montana brand tools, and it's got this cool little stop collar on it, which only allows you to drive the screw in as far as you set the depth of that collar. And once this first board is in, it's really just rinse and repeat after that. Now when it comes to the spacing between boards, it seems like everyone has a different way that they like to do it. I've seen some people that like to butt treated boards right up against each other, knowing that the board's going to dry out and leave a gap over time. But I like to be on the safe side and install my boards with an 1/8 inch gap in between, just to be safe. In order to get that 1/8 inch spacing I'm looking for, I like to use these little orange shims, which have an 1/8 inch shim on one side and a 3/16 shim on the other side. I wrap one side in blue painter's tape to make sure that that side's always facing up and I don't have to look at it every time. I just know that if that blue painter's tape is up, it's in the right orientation. Something you'll see me do a lot in this video that you might not see other people do is I use clamps a lot to make sure that I have consistent spacing in between my boards all the way down. And here's a little tip if you are putting new deck boards down on an existing deck. Leave the old boards on as long as possible. You can see the old boards back behind me there, and that's a great area to be able to walk freely on your deck without having to tiptoe around on joists. You can also put your tools up there. It's just a nice area to stage anything that you need, and you can take them off as you kind of work back down the deck. I'm guessing some of you at this point are saying, hey, I thought he said that he wasn't going to be doing any butt joints, but you can see that I'm butting these boards right up against the other ones, creating a butt joint. But don't worry, I'm going to come back and I'm going to cut a perfectly straight line with my track saw. So instead of trying to line up the ends of each one of these boards and get them perfect all the way down, I'll just leave them a little bit long and come back and trim them later. And here's a great way to check to make sure that your boards aren't getting skewed in either direction. And that's when you snap that first chalk line, also snap a second one in the middle of the deck. That way you can reference that and measure from each board to that line to make sure that one side isn't further out than the other. And now that I've gotten too close to the old deck boards, I can then go ahead and remove those, but I'll only remove a couple at a time because I still want that area to be able to walk around. And here you can really see how weathered and old these boards are. There was really no saving them. It was just time for new ones. Up until this point, I've been installing these boards so that they overhang on each side. Like I said, I'll be coming back and trimming them with the track saw, but when it comes to installing this next board, I have to cut it to size first because I won't be able to cut it after it's installed because it's too close to the fence post. And here's an example on the other side of the deck of what that looks like when all the boards are trimmed back, and this is so it can have this border, also called a picture frame, which wraps around the whole deck. More on that later. But this board not only needs to be pre-cut to size, it also needs to be notched out around this railing post, which is easy to do with a basic jigsaw. And just like that, perfect fit. And with these last few deck boards going down, that's really all there is to installing deck boards. Now let's trim them to size. Here I'm just using a straight edge so that I can draw a line for my track saw to follow. And if you're wondering why I'm doing it this way, why not just flush cut the boards right at the edge of the deck? And that's absolutely an option and honestly the easier way to go. I just really like the picture framing look. I think it just looks a little bit more finished and a little more professional. Because this first board was a little bit too close to this corner post, I had to go back and finish the cut with the oscillating tool. Here I'm just flush cutting the rest of the boards in front of the stairs. And remember how I started with the third board in on the front of the deck? Well, now it's time to go do all of those fun pieces that need to be notched around all the posts. I do this by lining the board up with the posts. I can then mark where the board needs to be notched, and then I make the cuts with a combination of the miter saw and a jigsaw. And just like that, perfect fit. And now it's time for what I think is the most satisfying part of this entire build, and that is this centerpiece that runs all the way down the deck. So I got the track saw back out and this time grabbed both of my tracks so that I could connect them for an extra long rip. This way I could do it in just 2 passes. And this was by far the most satisfying part of this entire build. And now I can move on to the final piece of the decking, which is this external picture frame. And I do it the same way that I did marking the other board that went around the posts, but here I show you how I actually cut out those notches using a combination of the miter saw, and then I'll come back with the jigsaw to clean it up. I started by doing each end first with the picture frame, and then I'll do both of the front pieces that break in the middle. And I did this because they're actually going to miter, have a 45 at each corner. And I thought that by doing both ends, I can set the front pieces on those ends to then cut the secondary miter, and then they'll come together perfect. And to keep those miters together, I went ahead and added a pocket screw. This way I can access it from underneath. It's completely hidden, but it'll keep that miter nice and tight. As I finish up these last few deck boards, there's one more thing that I just want to call out that I did off camera, and that has to do with all of those flush cuts that I made. Had this really sharp 90-degree edge, so I just went back and took a router with a 1/4 inch roundover bit and softened all those edges, and it made a big difference. And I bet some of you are wondering, well, how do you get this center board to run down the middle of a deck? You can't just do that with traditional joist spacing. And that's something I want to talk about here in a second, along with how I put in these posts for the railings. So first, let's talk about how to support that center board that runs down the middle. And I did it simply by flipping a 2x6 so that it's flat and then sandwiching it between two joists. Another option would be to run some vertical blocking about every 16 inches or so. This would save a little bit on material, but I thought this was by far the easiest way to go. And then moving over to the railing posts, I'm sorry I didn't get a lot of footage on this, but I at least wanted to show kind of a still shot of how I go about stabilizing this. And I do it just by putting 2 pieces of blocking in and then a 4x4 chunk next to the post and then screw everything together with lags, and this makes for a super stable post. Now with the deck top complete, my next step was to trim these posts to their final height. The height I went with was 36 inches, which is minimum for code, but I didn't want to have to block any more of the view than I had to. So again, I busted the track saw back out and cut these to their final height. I'm sure this is overkill and you can do this with just a regular circular saw, but I've got the track saw and it worked awesome for this. Next, I had to run top and bottom stretchers between each of the posts. To space the bottom one off the deck, I just used 2 chunks of 4x4 material, and this seemed to be a good height. And the top stretchers are just going to be installed flush with the top of the posts. And I attached the stretchers to the posts with 2 pocket hole screws on each side. And one thing to note here is I chose to put the pocket holes on the outside of the deck for 2 reasons. One being that if they were on the inside of the deck while you're standing on it, you're definitely going to see those pocket holes, and that's really how you're going to experience the deck 90% of the time. Number 2 is the deck is about 8 to 10 feet off the ground, so when you're standing on the ground, there's way less of a chance that you're going to see those pocket holes, and there's a chance that when we put up the wooden spindles, it's going to cover some of those pocket holes and just disguise them in general. After the stretchers were complete, it was time to put the top cap on the railing. For this, I chose to use the same material as the deck boards. So I started by cutting my first piece, getting it in the right position, and then measuring for the next pieces. And once I had all the pieces cut out, I took it a step further and I busted out the domino joiner. This is completely unnecessary and you do not have to do this, but I thought it was one, going to be a good experiment to see how this holds up outside with treated wood, and 2, I want all these joints to stay strong and together for as long as possible. So I thought it definitely can't hurt. I know some of you are probably going to give me crap for this, but I just want you to know that this is not necessary. You don't have to do this at all. You can just put some screws in, call it a day. I decided to take it a step further with the domino joiner and join each mitered corner and the one butt joint that has to be connected, put those together with dominoes, and we'll see how it holds up. But it looks good. And here is the one and only butt joint on this entire deck. Again, I put dominoes in it. Don't give me crap. I understand this is ridiculous, but I wanted to try it. And any exposed ends on this railing, I went ahead and added a 1/4 inch round over. And here's how all the joints turned out on the railing cap. And if you're wondering what those black things are on the butt joint, they're called pinch dogs, and they just help add a little bit of pressure to a glue joint when you can't clamp it. And now I can get to work on installing all of these wooden balusters, or spindles. To determine the length of my balusters, I measured from the top of the top stretcher on the railing to about a 1/2 inch from the bottom of the lower stretcher. And this gave me my distance, so then I could go back to the miter saw. I set up a little stop block, or on my miter saw here, I have this cool little stop feature where I can cut about 5 at a time and make sure that I'm getting them all exactly the same distance and quickly batch out as many as I can. And in order to install these, they really do need to be pre-drilled. If you try to just run a screw through the end of these, they're most likely going to split. Sometimes they won't, but most of the time they probably will. So in order to make this a little bit quicker, I just measured them out, drew a line across it, and then I was able to quickly drill through 2 at a time, and in no time they were ready to install. So when it came to spacing the balusters in each section, I knew that code was a baluster can't be any more than 4 inches apart from the next baluster. So knowing this, I did a little bit of math and determined how many balusters I would need per section on the deck. And I'm not going to try to explain the math in this video, but all I can tell you is that if you can determine how many balusters you need per section with whatever gap you want, if you have an even number of balusters in a section and you start in the middle working your way out, that means you're going to center the gap. The 4-inch gap is what is going to be centered in that section. If you have an odd number of balusters, then you will actually center a baluster in the middle and then work your way out. And you can see how I continue to use that spacer, working my way out, wedging it at the bottom, and then putting it at the top, just holding that in place while you screw it in. This goes very quickly once you get in a rhythm, once you get in a flow. I think I knocked out all of these balusters in under an hour once I got going. And if you're curious about taking on a project like this yourself, and you're wondering, well, how much would something like this cost? This project in total cost me just under $2,200. And I apologize if you wanted more details around the stairs I built here, but these are much more complex, much more complicated, and would have made this video at least twice as long if I went into all the detail that it took to build these stairs. I finished this deck a little over 4 months ago, and at this point I'm waiting for the deck to what's called season, where the boards will dry out and then be able to accept stain a little bit better. So I'll be letting this dry out through the winter and be staining it in the spring. And for the final touches, I painted the posts and the main beam that support the deck black, and then I added these solar lights just to add some extra lighting and ambiance to the deck at night.